We'll never truly know how many lives were officially on board and subsequently lost the night Titanic sank in the North Atlantic in April of 1912. It's fair to say, though, that over 2/3 of those aboard perished that night, which means of the estimated 2,200 passengers aboard, over 1,500 died. A mere 700 lived on. If you were a second-class male passenger on board, you had just an 8% survival rate. The stories are still haunting over a century later and lead to a dark fascination from the heroic to the tragic. But amidst an unparalleled event in history, there were some amazing survival stories that manifested from that night. In this video, we'll highlight 3 of them. Number 1, the Wimbledon Champion. Richard Norris Williams was an accomplished tennis player when he boarded the Titanic in 1912, traveling with his dad. Taught the game of tennis by his father, Williams had won the Swiss Championship the year before and had become one of the best young players in the world. He had planned to travel to America to take part in tournaments before going on to study at Harvard. In the hurried panic after Titanic famously struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic, Williams freed a trapped passenger from a cabin by breaking down a door. He was reprimanded by a steward who threatened to fine him for damaging White Star Line property, inspiring this scene in the James Cameron film. As Titanic began her final plunge, he and his dad stayed on the ship until the last moment. Once in the water, he saw one of the 4 funnels take his father's life and would later say the funnel missed him by a few feet. Williams swam until he got to a lifeboat. But even after he got to the boat, he spent hours with his legs in freezing water. He was rescued by the Carpathia and taken aboard the ship. The doctors on the ship wanted to amputate his legs, but Williams refused, saying he was going to, quote, need these legs as he didn't want to end his tennis career. He opted instead to work through the injury by simply getting up and walking around every 2 hours, around the clock, no matter how painful it was to his legs. Williams was back on the court within a year. He even won his first U.S. tennis championship. He would go on to serve in World War I and then resumed his tennis career, winning Wimbledon doubles in 1920. Number 2, the Titanic Orphans. In April of 1912, the mother of these 2 boys allowed their father to take the children for Easter weekend in France. But the father had a secret plan. The 2 were divorced. He was going to take the kids aboard the Titanic and leave for America for good. He took the boys to England, where they registered as second-class passengers on the ship under false names to avoid being tracked by the French police. When Titanic hit the iceberg, he took his 2 kids, placed them aboard lifeboats, and they would never see their father again. So the boys spoke no English. The father had gone down with the ship. When they arrived in New York, they had been traveling under false names and nobody claimed them. They were dubbed the Titanic Orphans and became a media sensation. A newspaper article from 1912 describes how the children responded to any question from the French consul with a simple "oui." They stayed temporarily in the home of another survivor, Margaret Hayes, who was on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Authorities, meanwhile, attempted to track down their relatives. Hayes spoke French, and she was able to communicate with the boys. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, their mother was frantically searching for her sons. She had by now understood that her husband had taken the kids, but of course, would have no idea they were aboard the Titanic. It took a month and dozens of newspaper appeals with photographs of the boys before their mother was found. As the newspaper stories started to make their way to Europe, she spotted an article with the boys' photograph. She contacted authorities and was able to confirm her sons' identities. After a long, much less dramatic trip across the Atlantic, she was reunited with her sons in New York. She would take them back to France, where they would live out their days. Interestingly, the body of the boy's father was among those recovered from the ocean. He's buried today in Nova Scotia. The oldest son, Mikkel, would go on to be the oldest surviving male in the Titanic. He passed away at the age of 92 in 2001. Number 3, the Titanic Violin. Of all the stories told about the Titanic, the ship's musicians playing until the very end is one of its most famous. But this survival story is not about a person, but about a particular item from that night. There were 8 musicians total aboard the ship. Before the sinking, they would play at tea time, after dinner events, Sunday service, amongst others. They were led by their band leader, Wallace Hartley. So following Titanic hitting the iceberg, Wallace and his band members played hymns on the deck to calm anxious passengers that were getting into lifeboats. This scene was of course famously recreated for the 1997 movie. Most survival accounts say the band played right up until the very end. All 8 of the musicians perished. Hartley was found 2 weeks after the sinking with a music case strapped to his body. Incredibly, it contained his violin. The case was propped up on the life preserver, allowing it to endure the cold, wet conditions. After it was salvaged, Hartley's fiancée gifted the violin to a music teacher of the Salvation Army. Almost 100 years later, it turned up in a woman's attic in 2006. After 7 years of research and testing, researchers determined it was in fact the same violin Hartley was playing as Titanic was sinking. It was sold at an auction for $1.7 million in 2013, officially making it Titanic's most valuable artifact. The director of the auction house that sold it at the time, Andrew Aldridge, said, I can honestly say I don't think any other article has made people show as much emotion as this one. If you made it this far through the video, thanks for watching. Please feel free to comment the stories from history below that you'd like to see, and we'll try to make a video on it. We'll see you next time on the channel.